Russia and China just vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution that would have protected commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, not because they thought the resolution was too strong. They vetoed it after it had already been watered down 3 separate times to try and get them to abstain. China's foreign ministry then publicly called the US naval blockade of Iranian ports dangerous and irresponsible, and Xi Jinping, in a direct call with the Saudi Crown Prince, issued his clearest statement, yet that the strait must remain open to normal navigation. Meanwhile, the US ambassador to the UN said Russia and China had deliberately chosen to turn a blind eye to Iran, holding the global economy at gunpoint. This is what is actually happening between the world's major powers over the Strait of Hormuz, and why it matters far beyond the Iran war itself. Start with the UN vote, because it tells you exactly where everyone stands. Bahrain, representing the Gulf states, brought a resolution to the Security Council, demanding that Iran stop attacking commercial vessels and cease any attempt to block freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The initial draft would have authorized countries to use all necessary means to ensure transit through the strait, which in UN language means military force was on the table. Russia, China, and France all said no. So the resolution was rewritten. All references to offensive action were removed. It became purely defensive in scope. Russia and China still said no. The language was weakened further, removing Security Council authorization entirely, limiting the resolution's provisions strictly to the strait itself and cutting out adjacent waters. Russia and China still said no. The final version simply encouraged countries to coordinate defensive efforts to ensure safe navigation and reaffirmed the right of states to defend their vessels from attack. That is as mild as a UN resolution gets. 11 of the 15 Security Council members voted for it. Russia and China vetoed it anyway. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia described the resolution as unbalanced, inaccurate, and confrontational. His argument was that it framed Iran as the sole source of regional instability, while the US and Israeli strikes on Iran were not mentioned at all. China's UN envoy Fu Kong said that adopting such a resolution when the US was threatening the survival of a civilization would have sent the wrong message. Both countries then said they were preparing an alternative resolution of their own on Middle East security, including maritime issues, which has not materialized as a formal text. The US ambassador Mike Waltz was direct in his response. He said Russia and China had marked a new low, that they had deliberately chosen to protect Iran's ability to hold the global economy hostage, and that Moscow was actively supplying Tehran with military equipment while Beijing was importing over 90% of Iran's illicit oil exports. That last figure is not disputed. China is by far the dominant buyer of Iranian crude, and those purchases are what have kept Iran's economy functioning at all under sanctions. Without Chinese demand for Iranian oil, the economic pressure on Tehran would be significantly more severe. The economic stakes are what make this more than a diplomatic argument between great powers. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important maritime choke point on the planet for energy. Roughly 20% of the world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas passes through that 21-mile-wide channel between Iran and Oman. Every barrel leaving Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, and Qatar goes through that water. When Iran closed the strait at the start of the war, the IMF cut its global growth forecast. Oil prices surged toward $100 a barrel and briefly spiked above $110, and energy shortages started rippling through countries that had nothing to do with the conflict. The UN General Assembly President told the assembled nations that trade disruptions from the closure were causing food and energy shortages for millions of vulnerable people worldwide. China's interest in this situation is not abstract or ideological, it is material. China imports more oil from the Gulf than any other country on Earth. It also buys Iranian oil at discounted rates because no one else will touch it under sanctions. It has trade and energy agreements with Iran that it intends to honor. When the US imposed its naval blockade on Iranian ports, Chinese state media and the foreign ministry responded quickly. The ministry spokesperson called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible and urged all parties to honor the blockade ceasefire agreement and take concrete steps to de-escalate so that normal traffic via the strait could resume. The message was aimed at the US as much as anyone else. Xi Jinping's intervention came during a direct phone call with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Xi said the Strait of Hormuz should remain open to normal navigation because it is in the common interest of regional countries and the international community. That is a carefully worded statement. It does not endorse Iran's closure of the strait. It does not endorse the US blockade either. It positions China as the party that wants commerce to flow freely, which also happens to be the position that best serves Chinese economic interests. What it does is put China formally on record as opposing any action by any party that restricts the strait, including American enforcement operations. Russia's position has been harder to characterize as neutral. Putin said at the start of the war that the US bombing of Iran had no justification and expressed support for the Iranian people. Russia has continued supplying military equipment to Iran through the conflict, which the US ambassador publicly accused Russia of at the Security Council. Russia also blocked the earlier UN effort to protect Gulf states from Iranian missile strikes. The consistent pattern of Russian behavior has been to prevent any multilateral action that would constrain Iran or legitimize the US and Israeli military campaign in any way. What the veto tells you is that the two countries most capable of applying meaningful pressure on Iran at the diplomatic and economic level have chosen not to. China could theoretically use its massive economic leverage over Tehran to press for reopening the strait. It has not. Russia could stop supplying military equipment. It has not. Instead, both countries have used their UN Security Council veto power to ensure that the international community cannot formally authorize any response to Iran's closure of the waterway, even a purely defensive one. The US response has been to act unilaterally through the naval blockade, which itself became the flashpoint that collapsed the latest round of peace talks. Iran called the blockade a ceasefire violation. Iran's foreign minister called the US the source of insecurity in the strait in a direct phone call with his Russian counterpart. Russia, in that same exchange, appeared to validate Iran's framing. The loop closes. Russia and China veto the UN resolution. The US imposes a unilateral blockade. Iran calls that a ceasefire violation. The peace talks collapse, and the standoff deepens with no multilateral mechanism left to manage it because Russia and China killed the only one on offer. The US accuses Russia of turning a blind eye to Iran holding the world economy hostage. Russia says the US started a war during nuclear negotiations and expects to be praised for it. China says the blockade is dangerous and irresponsible. Iran says it is only defending its sovereignty. 11 countries voted to protect the shipping lanes that every major economy on Earth depends on, and 2 countries with the permanent power to block that resolution used it. That is where this stands.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2026/273 please raise their hand. Those against,